You're listening to the Elegia by Catalan composer Josep Cervera in a performance by Leon Bosch, principal double bass for the Academy of St. Martin in the Fields, and editor of our new editions of works for double bass and piano by Cervera. My name is Jano Maha, and I am the editor-in-chief of Editions Violone and Alchus Publishing. I recently had the pleasure of speaking with Leon Bosch about this forthcoming project.
It is not often that one stumbles across something so enormous. A collection of at least 62 pieces that we know about for double bass. And not just any old pieces, they are truly spectacular and quite special historically also. There's so many things about it that make it unique. The first thing is that a lot of good instrumental music usually would have been inspired by a particular virtuoso. And sometimes, the two were entwined. The virtuoso was the composer as well. Much later on, when we began to specialize in the development of music, the virtuoso and the composer became separate entities. But here we have Cervera, who, much like a Rachmaninoff or the kind of classical virtuoso composer that we know of, here's Cervera, who was a phenomenal bass player and also a phenomenal composer. So what he presents us with are compositions of unique quality, and we know also that he was able to play every one of those pieces, and not just play them incredibly beautifully. So much so that reviews of his performances at the time speak very highly of his incredible capabilities as an instrumentalist. And so for us as instrumentalists now looking at this music and trying to realize what he intended and to try to bring this music to the world, there are challenges which we have to face. For example, the Carnival of Venice. Everybody writes the Carnival of Venice as a showpiece to demonstrate technical prowess. Paganini wrote one, Botticini wrote one, every virtuoso one could mention. We know the trumpet pieces. And this one is really quite special. 15 variations, each one of them presenting challenges, enormous challenges. Beautiful introduction and a beautiful finale. And it's the sort of piece that I think one has to dedicate oneself to completely and utterly. And for me, it's been really a really wonderful journey. I've been able to abandon myself to this music, completely and utterly. And with every particular genre one deals with, there are challenges. Now, in the Russian school of music, we knew that the Russians felt that they were seen as barbarians, and therefore they had to master the classical forms. So every Russian composer coming out of the Russian school had to write counterpoint, had to write a symphony, had to write a tarantella, had to use all the classical forms from Western Europe to demonstrate that they become civilized. But they retained something uniquely Russian in doing that. And then we have here the Catalan school, which has done something quite similar. In that Cervera, for example, and Botticini for that matter, and Pedro Valls, Botticini, of course, comes from the bel canto school, but if you look at what Botticini wrote for the double bass, traditional forms like the tarantella and romanzas and all these kind of things. See these names again in the Catalan school. But what they've done is they've Pedro Valls and Torello and especially Cervera have brought something unique of their geographical origins and the entire question of nationality. See, that what makes us human beings is the social context in which we become who we are. And that is never very far from the music with Cervera, and something very personal. And one realized that he was not just a great instrumentalist and a very good composer, but also a very fine human being. And that is particularly why I'm so delighted that this music was not lost forever. And my role in it is very small. All I have to do is to play it. The first thing I have to do is understand the style, to realize what the man really meant when he writes a romanza. What is a romanza? And when one realizes what he tried to tell us through his romanza, then you know what you have to do. With a reverie, it is easy to define a reverie or to look it up in the dictionary, but to feel what it is. With his Carnival of Venice, likewise, and with every piece, the final piece that he wrote, Grey Skies. James Testy, whom you've come across and who was in the process of writing a book, and I think it's going to be published soon, about the life of Cervera, talks about what Cielogris really means. It's a song without words, and it has this uniquely haunting melody. And in fact, it's so beautiful that apparently some violinist passing the shop where Cervera worked latterly, he was playing this particular piece, and the fiddle player walked in, haunted by this melody that he'd heard, and he asked for Cervera to make a version for the violin. Now this is what we have, things of such incredible, compelling beauty, haunting beauty. Every single piece is beautiful.
And that really is a mark of the Catalan school, isn't it? This lyricism.
Indeed. Okay. With Pedro Valls also, if you go backwards a little bit, look at his romanza, premiered by Pablo Casals on the cello. And again, it is incredibly beautiful. There's a composer in Britain by the name of Malcolm Lipkin, to whom I gave a copy of this disc of Pedro Valls' music, because Malcolm Lipkin was in the process of writing a piece for me, and he wanted to hear a little bit of how I play and what I do. So instead of taking my bass to his house to play, I sent him a few discs in the post. And he told me that he found that particular romance so haunting and so beautiful. And as you rightly point out, this is an element of the Catalan school. This ability to reach deep inside and to share something which we all really have in common, but sometimes have difficulty unearthing.
Yes. And speaking of Pedro Valls and his connection to Bottesini, how much Bottesini's influence do you hear in this music?
Well, curiously, with Cervera, not terribly much. I don't know whether you see it or find anything. If one looks at Pedro Valls, you find the connection much closer. And he, of course, studied with a student of Bottesini, by Roveda. And if you look at his compositions, also the Pedro Valls compositions, they're much closer to Bottesini, in that they're more Spanish bel canto, more bel canto than Spanish, with an element of Spanish. And there are certain pieces which are terribly, well, not Spanish, but Catalan. Spanish dances, the Zapateado and various other things in his Suite Andaluza, for example. But with Cervera, he's moved in a completely different direction. Well, not completely, but he is much more uniquely Cervera, using traditional forms, but expressing something truly unique and truly personal. But also, there's this confidence that he has. The times in which he lived, 1883 to 1969, if we look at other trends in music at that time, they're in a completely different direction. And yet Cervera has the confidence to remain with something which is apparently, I believe, also quite strongly an integral part of music: melody, harmony, rhythm, all these basic things. Music began to disintegrate during his period, and he didn't feel the need to wish to go down that route. He stuck to what he believed was right. And I'm delighted that he did, otherwise we'd be minus all this beauty.
Indeed. Where does Cervera fall in the Catalan school? A step beyond Pedro Valls, and moving perhaps in some ways in a more traditional vein. His music strikes me as being largely melody based, and perhaps
Absolutely.
based
Yes.
on traditional themes and songs, or at least that element of melody.
Yes, I mean, Pedro Valls himself lived in a particular period and had a particular attitude to music and did particular things, and he had some very, very illustrious students, and they took different paths. Torello became as famous as any bass player is likely to ever to be able to become, becoming principal bass of the Philadelphia Orchestra with Stokowski, and he had a fairly good amount of success prior to that, but also as a solo player, he achieved some success, and he became the first professor at Curtis. And it is through the collection that he gave to Curtis, the bequest, that I first came across this real whole area of music, this really exciting area of Catalan music. And honestly, I'm really truly ashamed that I'd never realized that all this existed before. I'd heard rumors about various things. Thomas Martin, esteemed colleague, had mentioned this connection that he had with Bottesini. And of course, I didn't really realize what he meant until I heard the Suite Andaluza, which Tom played at the ISB Convention in State College. And then I realized that going backwards, his teacher Roger Scott had learned with Torello, who'd learned with Pedro Valls, who'd learned with Roveda, who'd learned with Bottesini. So then I began to see what it really meant. And of course, then I began to look at the music of Pedro, to find the music of Pedro Valls, and realized that actually it wasn't that easy to find because it wasn't available. But I did trace the Torello bequest and then had access to the scores. And that, of course, led me on this incredible journey. And then I discovered that Torello himself had been a composer of some capability and distinction. And not only that, there were other students of Pedro Valls, and Cervera being one of them. But it was very difficult to pin anything down. And so with Cervera, for example, I knew that there was this man that had composed something for the bass, but I didn't really know very much other than I couldn't find out anything from anybody. So I did what the 21st century makes possible. I used Google, and I just put in the name Cervera and to see what would happen. And I then decided to write an email to everybody with the surname Cervera in the world. And fortunately, there were not too many of them, but I got one reply, just one reply. And this was from Carlos Cervera, who's the grandson of Josep. And within a very short space of time, we developed a very, very good friendship, and I had access to all these wonderful manuscripts. And then it became clear that I had to record this music because it was so beautiful. But with 62 pieces, I had to make a decision about what to do, which pieces to do. And I think that I've chosen relatively well and fairly representative pieces. And I think that maybe this is a project where everything has to be done in time. So if you give me a few more years, I hope to be able to record everything that Cervera wrote.
Well, it's certainly a substantial body of work. And you've selected a number of these for your first recording, which we're anticipating eagerly. And this also brings us to our project, the
Absolutely.
Publication of the printed editions.
Yes. You see, what you're going to be doing in making this music available to the world is something quite special. As I mentioned earlier with Pedro Valls, had there been music available with Pedro Valls in the public domain, I might have arrived at Pedro Valls a lot earlier. But because it required me to be a detective, it took me a little longer to get there. And look, being a musical detective is not for everybody. It just so happens that this is something that really drives me. I enjoy the process of hunting for those things which might otherwise never see the light of day. And it is only because I enjoy it that I happen upon these things. And I can tell you quite honestly that I never know where I'm going to go next in my musical journey, because wherever I go, I see other things. Initially, when I started my recording project, I was going to do all the Bottesini first and then move on. But each thing has led me to something new and a new discovery. So I can't imagine where we will go next. But I think that for the bass fraternity and for musicians in general, just knowing that this music will be available in a printed edition which they can feel and touch without having to do anything extraordinary is going to be one of the greatest services to the instrument and to music. So thank you for putting so much energy into the project, which I believe in so much.
I think it's an absolutely wonderful project, and like you, I revel in musical discovery and bringing wonderful pieces to a larger audience. Yes. And I think we're really grateful to primary researchers like yourself who make the initial discoveries, and also to, in this case, the estate of Cervera.
Yes.
who have been absolutely wonderful in making manuscripts available, actually quite widely, and
Absolutely.
also allowing us to make these printed editions available.
Absolutely.
These of course, are the first time that this music has ever been published.
Indeed. And that is quite special. And I think it's true to say that before too long, a lot of this music will become standard repertoire for the instrument. And the only reason that it hasn't already reached that status is because it's not been available. But this particular project, to publish it and to make it available, will ensure that some of these pieces will be known worldwide before too long.
We've talked some about how we might characterize these pieces. How would you see them as far as their role in a bassist repertoire?
It is difficult to project into the future, but since this is all quite new, but I could imagine in the future that Cervera would have as esteemed a place in the bassist's armory of repertoire as Bottesini does. Bottesini, of course, has become, and Dragonetti, they're hugely popular. Everybody has heard about Kusevitzky. I mean, Kusevitzky didn't write that much, but what he wrote, everybody knows, and every bass player learns, every bass player plays. But here we have a body of music so enormous that I cannot imagine that there will in the future be a bass player who has not played some music by Cervera. It will become central to the repertoire for the instrument. It is well written for the instrument. He understands the instrument incredibly well. There's nothing that you have to guess. There's nothing that you have to imagine. There's nothing that's impossible. He knows exactly how to write for the instrument. With some of the greater composers that have a higher status in the hierarchy, they often write for virtuosi, and their understanding of the instrument might not be as complete as it ought to be, which means that there are challenges. But in the respect of Cervera's music, he writes for the instrument that he plays incredibly well. So our job as instrumentalists is quite simple, really. All we have to do is to understand the emotional, musical, spiritual, and academic dimension of the composition. His command of the fundamentals and the basics, both as an instrumentalist and as a composer, was superlative. So for the future, I could see that bass players, young people, and the rest of us alike will be playing Cervera's music as a matter of course. He also wrote, as you probably know, a method for the double bass, and nobody writes a method until they believe that they know how an instrument works. Bottesini wrote a method which influenced generations. Petrovals wrote his method, refining aspects of Bottesini, and Cervera wrote a method. Now, Cervera brings some very interesting things to double bass playing. For example, the use of artificial harmonics is really quite extraordinary, and actually that requires a study of his very own. In the Carnival of Venice, he uses them so unbelievably well, and there's so much of it that one really has to grasp artificial harmonics in a way that one never really is required to, through the entire range of the instrument. It is quite extraordinary, the challenges that he presents, and quite fulfilling. And I think it is those aspects which will make his music endure, durable, and exciting for everybody.
This question of artificial harmonics, does he treat them uniquely, or is it a case of extensive use of them? What makes it unique in this context?
He used them very extensively, which I don't think there are any double bass compositions of that period or of any time which use them so extensively. And the way in which he uses them also is pretty special. I cannot think of any other composer that has used artificial harmonics in the way that Cervera does. Bottesini used natural harmonics, and Petrovals used natural harmonics, but here we have something quite out of the ordinary. The command of the instrument is so complete. I mean, there are tales of Cervera practicing the double bass between 8 and 10 hours a day, and he certainly didn't waste his time. He found out things which he has written about, and these compositions embody these unique discoveries and wonderful challenges. And I think that is pretty special.
The International Society of Bassists is holding their convention in Rochester, and you will be presenting the works of Cervera in a recital. That recital will be on Friday the 7th.
Correct.
And
yes.
I believe the time it's 2 o'clock, and people can reference the ISB schedule to double check those start times. But tell us a bit about this recital.
Yeah, I'm going to play a cross-section of pieces. I'm going to start with Fascination, which is a fantasy for bass with a theme and variations, which is kind of a fairly usual form. Cielo Gris, which was the last piece I wrote, and I spoke earlier about this haunting quality of the melody that it contains. Very special piece. And then I'm going to play also the Nocturne, which I think is so beautiful. I mean, it's melancholic in a way, but so touching, so beautiful. Also Romanza, which is one of my favorites. And then I'm going to play Recuerdos de Londres, Memories of London. And that's a little, very interesting piece, which he wrote after he'd been on tour to London with his Cobbler Orchestra. And the material of the national anthem of the United Kingdom is used very inventively, really inventively. And then the Elegia, which is the piece that most people will have encountered. There, I think, are one or two performances available online.
Yes.
Which can be heard. And it's truly spectacular piece, really beautiful. Most people think that this is one of his real gems. And then the Berceuse, which again is truly special. And then I'm going to play the Introduction and Tarantella. Now, the Introduction and Tarantella is really quite spectacular. Every composer for the bass writes a tarantella. There's a Glier tarantella, there's a Botticelli tarantella, Pedro Valsa, everybody writes tarantella. But this one is something else, something to behold. And I look forward to seeing as many of our colleagues there to come and hear the music of Cervera. I intend to enjoy it, and I'm sure that everybody else will find something in it also.
We'll also be presenting the newly published editions at
Absolutely.
the convention. And so there will be music for people to take home with them.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it is not often one can go to a convention and to go home with a bag full of music of such beautiful things that one has never encountered.
Entirely new works.
Absolutely. And I think there's nothing more beautiful and special. I wish I could experience this kind of euphoria all the time.
Well, thank you so much, Leon. Thank you for joining me today, and thank you for your work on behalf of bassists worldwide and making new things available to all of us. And I look forward to seeing you in Rochester.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you soon.